Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online program titled Tomorrow is Another Day, Best-Selling Novels of the Great Depression Era. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight and host this program. So for those of you out there that might be new to the Book Club of California, we're a nonprofit member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with a focus on the literature and the history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books. We have a scholarly journal and member newsletter called the Quarterly Newsletter, and we have keepsakes for our members. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs, like the one this evening, on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, book history, California history, print culture, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit us online at bccbooks.org to join or donate or just find out more about the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's program. Tonight's program is titled Tomorrow is Another Day, Best-Selling Novels of the Great Depression Era. And our speaker is David Welky. Now, David Welky is a professor of history at the University of Central Arkansas and the interim chair of the university's history department. He has written or edited 12 books on topics ranging from the history of film to the World War II era civil rights movement to the life of Ronald Reagan. He has also published book chapters, scholarly articles, newspaper pieces, and other writings on a variety of subjects, including presidential history, my favorite, Superman comic books, and the Olympic Games. He has taught courses in recent American history, the United States during the Great Depression and World War II, the United States and the Middle East, American film history, podcasting, and the history of the American Western genre. Now, David Welky holds a BA in history from the Northeast Missouri State University, which is now called Truman State University. A little piece of trivia there for you. And he has an MA in history and a PhD in American history from Purdue University. And tonight, our speaker will be talking about the best-selling novels of the Great Depression era. Now, I expect you'll hear a lot of new and interesting things, but you're certainly going to hear about the popular consumption of some of your favorite novels, like Gone with the Wind and The Good Earth, for example. If you have questions for our speaker, you can use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom. We will certainly have time for a conversation with David Welky at the end of the presentation, and I'll curate that conversation from the topics and the questions that you all put in the chat and the Q&A. And now it's my great pleasure to turn over the controls to our speaker, David Welky. David, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you for that very generous introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming this evening. I really appreciate it, and I hope I give you some interesting things to think about. So yeah, I am going to talk some about the best-selling novels of the Great Depression era, and just a little bit of background. I'm going to assume that you have at least some familiarity with the Great Depression, but just to kind of put you in place, put you in the mindset. The 1930s, the decade of the Great Depression, was the worst economic downturn in American history. We're always start with a joke, right? We're talking about a time when thousands of banks and thousands of businesses went under, when millions of Americans were unemployed. And maybe when you think about the Great Depression, that might conjure up images of bread lines, or perhaps Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. It is also a time of rising totalitarianism around the world, rising dictatorship around the world. And so, just the picture that I'm trying to paint for you is that the Great Depression era was a time of incredible fear and frustration. It was a time when nothing felt stable, nothing felt steady or reliable, when everything felt sort of uprooted. And so the question that I want to look at is, well, how does the novel fit into this era? How did the novel address these concerns, these issues? Did best-selling novels address these issues? What attracted Depression era readers? And what can these novels tell us about that period of the Great Depression? Because I think it's very easy to for historians to dismiss novels, to say, well, they're just escapism. Okay. No. In the case of the 1930s, it might be clear what Americans would want to escape from, but I think it's also significant for us to think about what are they escaping to? What are they escaping to? I think once you start considering that question, then you can really gain some deeper understanding of that period. So, with that, just let me immerse you briefly in kind of the general book landscape of the Depression era, of this time when, again, millions were out of work, when fear, when panic seemed the order of the day. What is happening in the world of books? Okay. I don't know if maybe any of you are involved in the publishing industry or know the industry well, but if you are, I think maybe this opening quote might resonate with you. Publishing is the best place in the world to learn how not to run a business, from 1938. Publishing is a tough business. Publishing has always been a tough business. And the Great Depression, as you can imagine, makes a tough business even tougher. You know, if you're concerned about the future of the book here in the 2020s, maybe it makes you feel a little better to know that 90 years ago in the 1930s, a lot of publishers were convinced that the book industry was on the verge of collapse, that they were facing an existential crisis, that the book was dying amid the Great Depression. But in the 1930s, America was very much a reading nation, but it wasn't necessarily a book reading nation. Just a few numbers to sort of back that up. Right? In the 1930s, the United States had about a 95% literacy rate. So we are a nation of readers. But in that same period, only about 17% of Americans said that they read books. On average, as near as we can tell, Americans bought about 2 books a year, okay, on average. That includes school textbooks. But really, that's quite misleading. In that in the 1930s, I think, as is the case today, people tended to buy a lot of books or no books. Okay. So this is a bit of a deceptive statistic, but it does give you a sense of that idea that we're not necessarily a book reading nation in the 1930s. As near as we can tell, book readers tend to be, there are, of course, exceptions, but they tend to be more white, more middle class, more urban professionals. These are the people who tend to buy and read books. Okay? In part, that's related to opportunity. Okay? Let's remember, however you feel about this, there was no Amazon in the 1930s. Just acquiring a book, just purchasing a book, can be a difficult thing to do. There are in the entire United States only about 500 bookstores in the 1930s. Something like 1/4 of Americans live in a county that does not have a bookstore in it. Okay? If you get into rural America, that's more like half of rural Americans living in a county that doesn't have a bookstore in it. Okay? And so I just want to give you a sense of, who are we talking about? Which Americans are we talking about when we think about readers of novels during the Great Depression era? Okay? So with that little bit of introduction, the question that follows up is, well, which books should we look at? If we're thinking about the Great Depression era, what are the ones that we should be talking about? And again, a bit of a disclaimer, right? The United States is a big country. There are lots of Americans. And depending on which books you choose, which novels you choose to look at, you can get very different impressions of the past. But I did want to look at novels first because that is the bulk of the book market in the 1930s. Something like 85% of book sales during this period were novels, were fiction rather than nonfiction, which I hope helps to explain why I'm focusing on fiction, on novels. One instinct, if you're thinking about, well, which books to talk about, one instinct is to go for things that seemed new, exciting, like distinctly 30s. What seems to speak most directly to the times? What's new? What's exciting? And so, in thinking about which books and what's new and what's exciting, I put together this little kind of imaginary bookshelf for you of things that we could have looked at. This is the period of William Faulkner, for example, and his literary experimentation, or John Dos Passos and his USA trilogy, again, experimenting with the form and function of the novel. This is the era of the so-called proletarian novel, novels written about sort of gritty, working class, often but not always urban, Depression era environments. Perhaps you're familiar with the Studs Lonigan trilogy by James Farrell, probably the best known of these proletarian novels. Michael Gold's Jews Without Money is another fairly well known one. If you read these, you really feel the immediacy of the new, of the Depression. And they certainly have important things to say about the 30s and about the Depression. But the problem for our purposes is that, unfortunately, very, very few Americans read these books during the 1930s. Very few Depression era Americans read any of these books, which are better known today than they were in their own time. And that doesn't mean that they're irrelevant, that they don't have anything to say. I just think that that can be a little misleading if you choose to focus on those. So instead, I chose to focus on the best-selling novels of this period to immerse myself and to, I hope, immerse you in things that people actually read at the time. And what that means, if you look at the best-selling novels of the 1930s, a lot of them are probably going to be things that you've never heard of. And so in my reimagined bookshelf, I'm guessing, I can't see a show of hands, but probably not a lot of you have read Green Light by Lloyd Douglas. Yet this was one of the best-selling novels of 1934. Or Caroline Miller's Lamb in His Bosom, another one of the best-selling novels, of 1934. You may have heard of George Santayana, but you probably haven't read his best-selling 1936 novel, The Last Puritan. Okay? So here you're looking at a very different uh, grouping, but this is where I'm going to put us today. But I will, fear not, I will steer us towards things that should be more familiar to us. And I'm not saying that these are better or worse or more or less reading or less worth reading than other novels. But again, I am interested in trying to get at, well, what did Depression era Americans actually escape to? Why did these books become bestsellers? And I suppose I should up front here warn you, there will be spoilers. I will be spoiling 90-year-old novels, so you've been forewarned. I think it's foolish or misguided to try to argue that every Depression era bestseller touched on the same theme, that they followed exactly the same formula. But I do want to try to isolate a few themes that I see running through these novels, all of which I believe speak to the Depression era. Okay? So, for example, they tend to have a pessimistic tone or a grim tone to them. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Quick diversion. The best-selling novels of the 1920s tended to be quite upbeat, quite optimistic. And again, these might be unfamiliar to you, but some of the most popular authors of the 1920s were people like Gene Stratton Porter and Harold Bell Wright. And their novels, again, were very optimistic. They tend to argue that hard work pays off, that clean living and fair play will pay dividends. But that kind of optimism, that sort of Pollyanna-ish view of society, that really feels out of place for readers in the 1930s at a time when everything seems to be falling apart due to things that we can't understand. Why did the Depression happen? Why did the Dust Bowl happen? Why the rise of totalitarianism? That kind of optimism feels out of place. Okay? So the 1930s will see a pretty pessimistic tone to our best-selling novels. We will also see that they tend to be set in a society in collapse. Again, quite relevant to the 1930s, quite relevant to the Depression era. What we'll see in these books is really a struggle for survival against forces beyond one's control. Third, these books tend to center on the search for a home, for something stable, for something reliable. The characters in these novels don't tend to search for kind of big systemic solutions to society's problems. Instead, they tend to focus on save yourself. Okay? Save yourself. And finally, in terms of themes, they tend to be anti-materialistic in a sense that they're not really opposed to money or to trying to make money so much as they make the argument that money's not going to make you happy. And again, I hope you can see the relevance to the Depression era. If you've got all these readers saying, my goodness, I need to make money in order to feel content, well, looking around their world, they're going to be pretty miserable. And so the upshot of all of this is that these books tend to be sort of negative, sort of pessimistic, while delivering a positive message in the end. So that's the setup here, the background. Hope give you some things to think about. But I do want to apply this to specific novels. So let's get into some things that maybe you've heard of and see how this template applies to those best-selling novels of the Great Depression era. Okay? So ultimately, I'm going to talk about four novels, okay? Each of which was a blockbuster in their era, and each of which I think reflects these themes that I just mentioned. The majority of these are probably familiar to you, but we'll see. Okay? So first, and for the most part, I'm going to go in chronological order here. The first book is Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, okay, which was the best-selling novel of both 1931 and 1932. You see Pearl Buck there on the left. This is a book that really came out of nowhere in the sense that Pearl Buck was basically an unknown author. She was the daughter of missionaries, American missionaries who worked in China. She grew up in China, was really more familiar with Chinese culture than American culture, and really grew up convinced that the Chinese understood the world better than those American missionaries did. So she's a very pro-Chinese mindset. She writes a book about a novel about China called East Wind, West Wind. 28 presses reject it. So if there are any aspiring novelists out there, perhaps you can take some solace from this. 28 presses rejected her first novel, which was finally published to good reviews. No sales, but good reviews. The Good Earth is her follow-up to that novel. She wrote it in 3 months, so it was pretty quick, and it turns out to be a hit. And it's got a lot going for it. If you've read the book, it's dramatic, it's fast-paced, it's got interesting characters, it's got an exotic setting for Americans. It also hits in 1931 at a time when China was very much in American news. There's a horrific flood on the Yangtze River in 1931. There's a civil war in China in 1931. So Americans are reading about China in their newspapers. And so even though she hadn't really intended to connect with Depression era Americans, she ended up finding something that felt kind of familiar to them despite its exotic setting. Her protagonist, a Chinese farmer named Wang Long, felt very American to her readers. As one reviewer put it, The Good Earth could have been set in North Dakota instead of a northern province in China. Uh, Wang Long, again, was a farmer. He works hard, he saves money, he's convinced he'll be a respectable man one day if he just lives right. But it's hard times. And I hope you can kind of see how this is resonating with Depression era. It's hard times for reason beyond Wang Lung's control. There's widespread poverty, there's drought, there's war and dislocation. He ends up fleeing to a city, but only finds more poverty there, except it's a very unequal economic situation there, and that the rich have plenty, but the poor struggle just to survive from day to day. There are these gripping scenes of Wang Lung waiting in line just to get a few spoonfuls of rice. And so if you're viewing this from a 1931 perspective, again, that this is sort of bread lines, poverty, inequality, you can feel that connection between your world and Wang Lung's. Also, like in the United States of 1931, 1932, there is talk of revolution in Wang Lung's environment. And this is an important point because I think a lot of people want to imagine the 1930s as this kind of time of sort of revolutionary popular culture and radicalism. But in The Good Earth, Wang Lung hears these cries for revolution, but ignores them. He's uninterested in communism or other radical movements. He just wants to go home to the farm. He wants to go home to the land and work hard and be a respectable farmer. And he keeps working hard despite all the obstacles that are thrown up at him. And in the end, remember, I said there'd be spoilers. He actually does become a wealthy man. but he finds that the wealth, the money brings no joy. It brings no happiness. It only causes strife and discontent. All he wants is his little farm. And so ultimately, the good earth becomes about surviving through hard times, overcoming forces beyond one's control, seeking fulfillment in home and stability. So, again, if you can run it through those themes that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the grim tone, the society on the verge of collapse, the search for a home, the anti-materialism, they're all here in the good earth. And I think what's notable finally is that Pearl Buck didn't set out to write a bestseller. She 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 barely even knew the United States, but her novel and American society in this period just happened to intersect. And so that's the first of our best-selling novels, our first test, as it were, of our four themes. So again, probably many of you have heard of The Good Earth. Maybe many of you have read The Good Earth. Our second novel, I'm going to guess, is different. And I wish I could see a show of hands for how many of you had read Hervé Allen's Anthony Adverse. I know there's just one person out there saying, me, me, me. But this was, even though it's not well remembered today, it was a huge seller, the best-selling novel of both 1933 and 1934. It becomes this kind of cultural touchstone. It works its way into popular culture. It's it's a massive book. It's more than 1,200 pages long, in case you're, thinking about, well, I say if you were thinking about picking it up, but be careful with your back if you are trying to pick it up. But, there are jokes at the time of, the man who racked up $47 in library fines before he could finish reading it, things of that sort. And Anthony Adverse was, again, like The Good Earth, a very unlikely hit. It was not designed to be a Depression era bestseller. Hervé Allen was not well known at the time. He was kind of a drifter without purpose. Um, he was from a prominent family, Pittsburgh family, but hadn't really found his direction in life. He got an economics degree, but wasn't really interested in that. He kind of wandered off and fought alongside General Pershing against Pancho Villa in the 1910s in Mexico. He served in France during World War I. After that, he wrote some poetry. He wrote what is honestly a pretty mid biography of Edgar Allan Poe, but he decided that he wanted to write a big novel. And so in 1929, this is like even before the Depression really started, in 1929, he started assembling notes for some big piece of historical fiction. Like he didn't really have it all charted out in his mind. He just had this idea of some orphan named Anthony who kind of does things in the 19th century. Like it was that vague. And he researches the book, but the research is it's chaotic. It's almost random. He's like, well, let's put Napoleon in it. So I'll research Napoleon. So we'll set it in France or part of it in France. And he's like, well, I like New Orleans. So we'll do part of it in New Orleans. And I know El Paso from when I served with General Pershing. So we'll put El Paso in it. And it's just this sort of almost random of collection of interests searching for a plot. But ultimately, he carves out this story, this piece of historical fiction, and publishes it in 1933 to again raves, huge sales, and comments a lot like what you saw with The Good Earth. As one reviewer put it, one needs no inside knowledge to be able to draw for himself the exact parallel between the economic convulsions created by the Napoleonic Wars and those the world is even now attempting to iron out. Okay? In other words, much like Pearl Buck, Hervé Allen just kind of like stumbled into relevance, as it were. As for the book itself, I'm not even going to try to summarize it. Okay, it's just too big. I guess all I can say is that if you happen to be a fan of The Count of Monte Cristo, which is on my shelf over here, like that's sort of the closest equivalent that I can find. And so if The Count of Monte Cristo is your jam, maybe give Anthony Adverse a shot. But it's basically, again, this orphan who grows up in England, but moves to France and is part of what's presented as a dying society. Again, similar to our themes here, pre-Napoleonic Europe, an age of collapse and corruption, followed by the tyranny, the totalitarianism, if you will, of Napoleon, and then a time of economic greed as international plutocrats take over. Anthony tries to navigate this chaotic environment. And he does so, in a sense, by kind of dipping a toe into all the ideological movements, the philosophical movements of the day. And in essence, as Hervé Allen presents it, kind of recreate the process of becoming an American. What I mean by that is along his journey, he meets characters who expose him to Catholicism and the Enlightenment and Shakespeare and Milton and Dante and Calvinism and evangelical Protestantism and commerce and capitalism, all these threads that become associated with the United States, becoming, as Hervé Allen puts it, quote, a citizen of the Western Hemisphere. And ultimately, the citizen of the Western Hemisphere comes to the United States. Throughout his journey, hundreds of pages of journey, Anthony Adverse remakes himself, reinvents himself over and over again. Okay? In England, bullies steal his cloak and leave him naked. He ends up in Cuba, buys a linen suit, again, being ritualistically stripped and then reclothing himself in a new environment. Uh, in the American wilderness where he settles, he wears a bear skin, So he's this sort of shapeshifter looking for some kind of home, looking for some kind of stability. So again, grim tone, pessimistic tone, unsettled, corrupt, collapsing society, the search for a home, they're all there in Anthony Adverse. Along the way, much like Wang Lung in The Good Earth, he makes a fortune and rejects a fortune. He finds that wealth, money, it's empty. It doesn't bring joy. It doesn't bring contentment. It doesn't bring happiness. He vows instead to make a home in the symbolically named town of La Luz, the light, and live a simple life, a non-materialistic life, not trying to understand why things happen, but just find individual contentment. Again, much like Wang Lung. But the novel ends, and spoilers, the novel ends on a pessimistic tone. The final scene takes place years after Anthony Adverse dies, when a group of pioneers to the American West discovers he had a statue of the Madonna, which became his symbol of peace and home and connection to God. And this group of pioneers finds this Madonna statue and they use it as a target in a shooting contest and shatter it, leaving you at the end kind of like, well, there is no hope. So to be sure, you can enjoy, if you've got a lot of reading time, you can enjoy Anthony Adverse without thinking about themes or symbolism or anything like that. It's an action story. There's exotic locations, there's interesting characters, but also it's quite relevant to the 1930s. That's part of why it became such, again, a huge blockbuster. There's there's two, one of which you probably heard of, one of which you probably haven't. Some of you might be saying, wait, there's one I know that's clearly very directly relevant to the Great Depression. And if anybody's out there yelling for Grapes of Wrath, yes. The Grapes of Wrath was the best-selling novel of 1939. And here I'm going to be pretty brief because I think this is the best known, the most read by y'all of the bunch. Again, just check through that list. Pessimistic tone. If you know the Grapes of Wrath, yeah. A society in collapse, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some things worth noting here. All right. This is, as you may know, the story of the Joad family, Okies, uprooted from their farms, traveling to California. The name Joad calls to mind road. It calls to mind Job, the biblical character of Job. They work hard, and similar to Anthony Adverse and Wang Lung, they have modest goals. Okay, they don't want to get wealthy. That's not what they're pursuing. They just want a home. They just want stability. But their world, like Anthony Adverse's world, like Wang Lung's world, falls apart for reasons beyond their control. Okay? They can't control the Dust Bowl. They don't control the banks that own the land. They don't control technological unemployment, the rise of the tractor, which helps push them off their farms. They don't control the nameless, faceless big growers who control California agriculture. It's a world beyond their control, and all they want to do is try to find a little home, a little peace within it. Okay. It is, in some ways a radical novel, but I think it's also important to think about, particularly if you're thinking about who's reading novels in 1939, it's important to recognize also that it has very traditional elements to it. Like Wang Lung, the Joads are not embracing radical revolution. Instead, they're embracing kind of a very traditional Jeffersonian notion of sort of yeoman farmers, self-supporting farmers. And after all, that's what, one of the supporting characters, the preacher Jim Casey, whose initials JC, suggest that maybe this is a prophet who should be listened to. This is what Jim Casey calls for. Again, kind of a Jeffersonian community based on yeoman farmers. And in the end, the book is pessimistic. Tom Joad is not getting a house with a picket fence. Anthony Adverse's Madonna was destroyed. Wang Lung's sons, more spoiler here, Wang Lung's sons are going to sell the land that he worked so hard to reacquire. So again, our themes, they're all quite different, these three novels so far, but they all check a lot of the same boxes. And in that way, they resonate with the mood, the mindset of the Depression era. Okay, finally, the last one. The 800-pound gorilla, the 1,000-page gorilla bound in Confederate gray, Gone with the Wind. Okay, the best-selling novel of 1936 and 1937. Okay. Like Anthony Adverse, like The Good Earth, this wasn't intended as a depression novel. It wasn't really meant to be timely, even, but it just happened to hit the national mood at that moment. Okay? And you can read this book without even thinking about our themes. It's got action, it's got interesting characters, it's got an environment that is both sort of exotic yet feels familiar. Okay? Before we get into this, uh, two quick things up front. Okay, first, do not confuse the novel Gone with the Wind with the movie Gone with the Wind. Okay. There's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences as well. So things you might be thinking about from the film doesn't necessarily work that way in the movie. Okay. So that's one disclaimer. Okay. My other disclaimer before we get into this is that, like, I know. I know that Gone with the Wind is not good history. I know that it's problematic. I know that there are certainly racist elements to it. I'm aware of all of that. And so I am trying to um, present this from the perspective of the 1930s. Okay, so two quick disclaimers. But Margaret Mitchell, her friends called her Peggy, was born in Atlanta, born upper class. She grows up in the world of kind of lost cause mythology, the world of birth of a nation. She's surrounded by reminders of the Civil War. She marries pretty young. She marries a guy by the name of Clifford Henry, who dies in World War I. And if you're a Gone with the Wind fan, you can say, okay, Clifford Henry, first husband, CH are the initials. Well, in the novel, Scarlett O'Hara marries her first husband, Charles Hamilton, CH, who dies in the Civil War. Okay? Uh, Margaret Mitchell remarries after Clifford Henry dies. She marries this dashing, handsome bootlegger named Red, not Rhett, but Red Upshaw, divorces him, and then marries a third time a pleasant but rather uninteresting person named John Marsh. And she gets a job writing about history, about women's issues for the local newspaper, the Atlantic Journal. And she writes a lot of pieces about the Civil War, and that's where Gone with the Wind comes in. Okay? In 1926, so this is years before the Great Depression begins, she hurts her ankle and she's bedridden for a lengthy period of time recovering. And she decides, I'm bored, I'm going to write a novel. Okay? And of course, she's going to write about what she knows the best, which is the Civil War. Again, like Anthony Adverse, it's a chaotic process. She's not writing to publish. She's writing historical fiction largely from memory, just sort of things that she thinks she knows. She writes five different openings. She doesn't know how the book's going to end. She's just writing for herself. And as she finishes each chapter, she sticks the pages for the chapter in a manila envelope and just kind of tosses each chapter around the apartment. So seriously, like she's using chapters of what becomes Gone with the Wind to like prop up furniture legs and smooth out couch cushions. But by 1929, after years of noodling around with this, she finishes what she calls Tomorrow is Another Day and then puts it away. She has no interest in publishing it. And it sits in her apartment for 6 years until 1935. We're now in the middle of the Depression when an editor for Macmillan is touring the South just looking for manuscripts to publish. And he hears these rumors of some big thing that Peggy Mitchell has. And he visits her and he says, hey, do you have a manuscript you want to show me? And she says, no, I don't have anything. He says, really? Like, no, I don't have anything. It's like, okay. And so this editor is getting ready to leave town. He goes to the train station in Atlanta, and suddenly Margaret Mitchell has a change of heart, and she throws all these manuscript pages into a trunk, and she drags the trunk to the train station, and she says, "Here." And so it's just this trunk full of envelopes that, if you stack them up, are seriously about as tall as she is. There are multiple opening chapters. It's all out of order. It's not clear what goes where. In her haste, there's a whole other novella that she stuck in there. But kind of the essence of it is there. And it's signed and it's published in 1936 with a lot of editing, a lot of cleanup work, fact checking, and retitled Gone with the Wind. Uh, they decided not to call it Tomorrow is Another Day because there were already 13 books in print that had tomorrow in the title. And it becomes a phenomenon. Okay? 2 million copies sold in the first year. As of today, it sold about 30 million copies, so it still sells well today. And Margaret Mitchell is absolutely baffled by its success. And its success breaks through the normal boundaries of novel readership. Think back to the beginning of, who tends to read novels. Margaret Mitchell goes way beyond that. As she puts it, trying to describe it, Gone with the Wind's success, she calls it a freak. One of those things that isn't supposed to happen, but does happen ever so often. The bench and the bar like it. Judges write me letters about it. The medical profession must like it. Most of my letters from men and my phone calls from men are from doctors. The psychiatrists especially like it, but don't ask me why. And now the most confusing thing of all, file clerks, elevator operators, sales girls, telephone operators, stenographers, garage mechanics, clerks, in other words, people who don't usually read novels, school teachers, they all like it. And so I know I'm running out of time. I'll try to accelerate here for you, but to quickly run it through our formula. Okay? A grim and pessimistic tone, a society in collapse. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. If you have the movie in mind, okay, forget Scarlet at the end, looking skyward and saying tomorrow is another day and the music swelling and all that optimistic Hollywood stuff. Scarlet and her characters are in what she calls an upside down world. You know, no Stranger Things jokes there, if that's your thing. An upside down world. You know, the security of the Old South, and I can remember my disclaimers a few minutes ago. The security of the Old South has been destroyed by the Civil War. Society is in upheaval. And then as we move along into the Reconstruction era, the post-Civil War era, it's crude and garish and immoral. Okay? And this upside down world, it's all out of Scarlett O'Hara's control. She doesn't understand the war. She doesn't understand this crumbling social system. She doesn't understand why her first two husbands died, why her daughter died. It feels like random or too big to control. Undesirable change is being forced upon us, she believes, much as we've seen in our other novels. The struggle for survival that we saw in our other novels, absolutely, and she is ruthless about it. Okay? Much of her character will be softened for the movie. But quick examples. She marries her sister's boyfriend, okay, guy Frank Mitchell, because he has enough money that he can pay taxes on Tara. So she marries him. Uh, in post-war Atlanta, she starts a business. She buys a lumber mill and is just, again, ruthless. She hires cheap convict labor. She fraudulently grades lumber so she can jack up prices, so profiteering. But as she puts it, money is the most important thing in the world. And for embracing this materialism, she is punished. Okay? Her children fear her, men leave her, she's friendless, she's unhappy. Okay? Money does not bring contentment or happiness. Ultimately, what brings contentment, run it through our filter again, is a home. stability. And central to the plot of Gone with the Wind is this search for a home, okay? Her ancestral home of Tara. Okay? And Mitchell, not so subtly, makes the connection between Scarlet and the importance of the land throughout the novel. I mean, the very name Tara calls to mind Terra, land, right? Or she talks throughout the book about the importance of the red soil of Georgia, how the red soil of Georgia is in her blood. Okay, blood, red, the soil, red. Even the name, Scarlet, Rhett, her lover, Rhett Butler, Rhett, red, Scarlet. It all fits together. Whenever she's struggling, whenever she's desperate, she returns to the land. She returns to Tara to reinvigorate her lifeblood. Ultimately, she accepts that what she wants is Tara and the land. And her profiteering, her materialism, her general horribleness has cost her Rhett Butler. So there's a cautionary tale there, but she finds contentment and some sense of stability in the red soil of Tara. And so ultimately, just looking at these four novels, we see four books, four smash hit bestsellers that are all realistic and yet escapist, okay? Pessimistic and yet optimistic. Okay? They are, I would argue, windows into the desires of Depression era American readers. They want to read about people like them, people going through struggles, but kind of at a safe remove, an exotic time or an exotic location. But they want reminders that the struggle can pay off, okay? That there is such a thing as contentment in things that seem realistic at that moment. Okay. Land, home, family, stability. And ultimately, the best-selling novels of the Great Depression era are a search for home. Okay. And so with that, I'll leave it. I'm sorry, I think I went a little bit over, but I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take a shot at any questions that you might have. So thank you very much for sticking around.
I'm still here, and we
Oh,
still have
thank you.
about 80 or so folks who did stick around. If you want, you can stop the share, and then our faces will be a little bigger on the screen so people can
Absolutely.
see you for the discussion. And I'm going to just start by saying that was fun. It was kind of like part walk down memory lane for some of these
Mhm.
books, like the Good Earth. I remember reading that in high school, and of course, one of my mom's favorite books was Gone with the Wind, and everybody
Right.
knows the movie. So that was kind of fun, but then also this was
Mhm.
very thought provoking in terms of like what they all had in common and how they really fit the time that they were in and how they became popular.
You.
Um, and maybe why they became popular. I think there's a great question that was just put in the Q&A about like you because these were bestsellers, right? So they were popular, people bought them. But was there anything else kind of pushing like these novels to people? Any kind of marketing
Mhm.
or an attempt to get people into these books as a distraction, maybe from the world that is going on.
Yeah, so first I'll just say I will check the various branches of the San Francisco Public Library in a few days to see if there are any copies of Anthony Adverse left. But everyone running to that. Yeah, it's but to your question, it's a really interesting time kind of ideologically in the book industry, and that there are a lot of people, and this may be hard to believe, there are a lot of people in the publishing industry asking themselves, do we want to sell more books?
Yeah.
Do we want to broaden our audience? It's almost a spiritual question that I think, stretches back to American publishers' early days among sort of the Boston elite and all that. But there is this question of, are we just selling another product? Are we no better
Mm.
than profit chasers, or are we selling culture? But at the same time, to your point, we really see in the 1930s the industrialization of the book industry in many ways.
Mm.
That
Mhm.
this
Mhm.
is the time when we really start seeing more aggressive pushes to market books. When there's a sense that we've got a hit on our hands to push it. This is a time when publishers like Doubleday, for example, is pushing mail order sales. I've seen
Mhm.
some questions regarding that. So trying to expand the reach of book sales. This is when book clubs, things like the Book of the Month Club, really come of age. I think the Book of the Month Club was founded in 1926, if I remember, but again, coming of age in the 30s, more extensive market research. This is the age, the era when we see really the first successful experiments in mass market paperbacks. So pocket books.
Uh,
Uh, I always think, when you go to a used book sale and you find, the little mass market paperback that used to sell for a quarter, that's coming out of this period. And so, yeah, we are trapped in this moment of sort of questioning, but clearly on
mhm.
the road to what I guess we can call the industrialization of the book market. It's a long
Yeah.
answer there, but
No, it's good. That makes sense. There's a couple of questions about the role of libraries at this
Mhm.
time,
Yeah,
and also like how much did these books cost? Because this is the Depression, right?
right.
So were people saving up to buy these books? What was their price point? Were they
Right.
sharing them? Were they getting them from libraries? What
Yeah,
might you know about
so
that? Yeah.
a hardback book, and most books at this time that you're going to buy are still going to be hardbacks. A big book like Gone with the Wind would go for about 250 or so.
Mm.
I'd have to kind of put that in today's terms a little bit. I'd have to do some currency conversions, but between $1.50 and 250 would be a good kind of target for a new hardback. Libraries are stuck in difficult times. There are still a lot of kind of subscription libraries, where you're basically paying for a membership to a
Mhm.
library. And public libraries, as you can imagine, are devastated by the Depression. So they're really struggling. And also, we need to remember that a lot of Americans at this time didn't have easy access to a public library. Something like uh, something like 50% of Americans at this time lived in rural areas and had very little access to libraries. And so, yes, sometimes people would get these books from libraries, but there are some things that make it less accessible than
Mhm.
it would be today. I see in a comment that according to AI, that'd be about $61 today for a best-selling hardback. So, well, a little more than today's currency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned like 85% of the sales around this time were the novels, right? What
Yes.
what what were the other sales? Were those academic books or
Yeah. It'd be
what were
nonfiction. Yeah. So I'm just
okay.
dividing into two big categories.
Sure, yeah, that
So in this period, in any given year in the 1930s, you'd have about 1,900 novels being published. Okay, and that accounts for about 85% of the book market in these years. Yeah, and then the rest is nonfiction, history, economics, that sort of thing.
yeah. I think Anthony Adverse is like 1,200 pages long, something crazy like that, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, Gone with the Wind looks long until you set it next to Anthony Adverse, and then
Yeah.
like, oh, I can get through Gone with the Wind, and no problem. But all of these books are page turners,
Hmm.
so they're all worth a read,
Yeah.
definitely.
So I think you told me that you did this thing where you were reading like the three most popular books for every year during
Yeah,
the Depression.
yeah.
And that's how you kind of came up with some of some of your scholarship, right?
Mhm.
And this talk. What are some of the books in there that we that were super popular that we may have never even heard of. Anthony Adverse was a movie, right?
Yeah, it was a movie in 1935. I think it came out, maybe 1936. So if
Yeah.
someone wants to check me on that. Um, so yeah, as part of this project, I read the top three best-selling novels of each year of the Depression, and those numbers came from Publishers Weekly, from the period. Each year it published its bestsellers. Um, Sort of most of them you've never heard of probably, but a couple that I would recommend to people. Um, Perhaps some people have heard of Kenneth Roberts' novel Northwest Passage, which is about the French and Indian War. They made a movie of it with Spencer Tracy.
Hmm.
So if you like kind of historical fiction, that's a good one, quite readable. If you're a fan of The Good Earth, Pearl Buck's follow-up novel Sons, which I think came out in 1938. Uh, it's more of the same, essentially. So if you're into one, you'd be into the other. Um, there's an author who's not well known today named A.J. Cronin who wrote an interesting novel called The Citadel, a bestseller, which is about a physician, and it's set in a coal mining community in Wales. And it's an interesting story about kind of medical ethics and again the struggle through hard times. So that'd be one that I'd recommend. Um, One that people may know is The Yearling by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings Kinnan, sorry. Um, The Yearling, which is they made a movie out of it. Yeah, they made a movie out of it,
Yeah.
and it's incredibly depressing. It's this poor farm family in Florida, and their crops get smushed by the weather, and the kid gets a pet deer, and the deer eats the crops, and they regrow them, and the deer eats them again. And again, spoiler, he has to shoot the deer at the end, and it's awful. But one other book that you folks may not be as familiar with is by an author named Ellen Glasgow, and it's called Vein of Iron. I think it was 1935 also, Vein of Iron. And it's about four generations of women in Virginia struggling through depression and war. So it's timely as well. So those are some, I think, lesser known books that might be worth your attention on a depression era bestseller read through. Uh,
Nice. We're past the top of the hour, so we're going to wrap up. But I do have one more question, and I did want to let you know that I'm going to send you all this chat and the Q&A that you're probably seeing, so you can
Great.
kind of look through it and see if you want to respond to any of these interesting questions, because we definitely won't have time for all of them. But I'm wondering if there were any um, of these Depression era authors who
Mhm.
wrote kind of these iconic books with the main themes that you mentioned, those four themes, that went on to write something completely the
Completely
opposite
different.
of these main themes that they were
Oof.
known for. It might be
Yeah.
a head
Yeah.
scratcher for you, but it
Yeah.
seems like once you write one of these, you're probably writing more of these kinds
Yeah.
of Depression era books.
Or in the case of Margaret Mitchell, you're writing very little after that. Ooh,
Hmm.
yeah, it's that's a tough one. I would say Hervé Allen, in a sense, Anthony Adverse is his reversal because he was writing kind of experimental
Oh.
poetry and then
Hmm.
biography, and then flipped his own script. So I put that one out there. Um, Yeah, that's the one that comes to mind because George Santayana, of
Oh.
course. I think The Last Puritan was his only novel. Um, and yeah, I think that was his only novel. And of course, he went even more philosophical from there. But what is surprising I think, is how many of these bestsellers you look at and it's just like, nope, never heard of them. You know?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and I tried to think about today's best-selling novels, and I looked at the list from the best-selling novels of 2025 and 2026, and I just looked at them and like, no, I don't. There are a couple familiar names, of course, but it seems like today, sorry for the tangent here, it seems like the top spot changes almost every week now on the
Mm.
bestseller list. It seems like a much more fragmented and fluid market than you had in the 1930s. And so if whoever's left, if you're trying to think about, well, um, what do the best-selling novels of today say about 2026? The first answer is I don't know because I haven't read them, but it might be
Yeah.
more difficult to come
Hmm.
up with some kind of cohesive narrative because the publishing market is so much more fragmented now. At least that's the impression I get. Of
Yeah.
course, there are big sellers here, but it's surprising how often there's a new number one. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I think the last time, at least in recent memory, was the COVID period, where
yeah,
many of the bestsellers around the COVID period were about the COVID period and isolation
right,
and loneliness and you
right.
know those kinds of things. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, there's some great stuff in this chat and in the Q&A in
Yeah.
here. And I'll just say that Howard has a great last comment in here about all these books were movies, and that at some point were made into movies. A couple of years later, um,
Yes,
usually, but that kind of helps cement them as popular uh, for us now, right?
absolutely.
In addition to them being popular at the time as books and then as
Yeah.
movies.
In many cases, I think we remember the book because we remember the movie, and we may have seen the movie and kind of transplanted it onto the book. So, yeah, I mean, Hollywood, they've got people who are reading manuscripts before they're even publishing and saying, this might work, this might work, this might work. So, yeah, I mean, it's a
Yeah,
built-in audience, so you might as well capitalize. Why create something new when you've got something an audience will recognize already? No.
exactly.
Yes, that's
Exactly.
an excellent point.
Yeah. Okay, and we'll end on that excellent point because we are definitely past the top of the hour here, and we like to end just around 6 if we can.
Yeah,
And I know it's later where you are, so you're probably ready to
it,
unwind for the rest of
it
your day.
is.
So,
The sun
so
is
I'm gonna
going
say,
down. Sun is going down.
yeah.
But
So,
thank you so much to everyone, everyone who stuck around or was able to make part of it. Thanks for all the wonderful questions and comments. I'm looking forward to seeing those, and I really appreciate the work that the book club does, and I appreciate all of you so much.
well, we really appreciate you, and thank you so much for doing this talk for us, this presentation. And thanks again, everyone out there who's still with us. Still about 70 folks hanging on here, listening to this Q&A. So thanks for being with us a little later here on a Monday evening. Just a reminder that you can register for any of our programs online at bccbooks.org/programs, or you're probably getting an email from us with the upcoming programs. You can register for any of those by clicking a link in those emails. So we hope you'll come back and join us again for another online program or in person here in the club rooms in San Francisco or in person for a monthly event down in Pasadena. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, David. This was amazing. Makes me want to go out and maybe get Anthony Adverse. I don't know.
Give it
I
a
don't,
try. Give it a
I
try.
don't know. I'm gonna look at the description of it online first and see if I can get into it. Maybe it's not my jam. Um,
Mhm.
so thanks everyone. Thanks, David. Everyone have a wonderful night. Be well and take care of yourself, and we'll see you soon. Good night,
Thanks so
everyone.
much.